Welcome everyone to Byte-Sized Ethereum, where we make learning about Ethereum accessible for everyone. Today is our second episode ever. How are you feeling, Topher?
I'm feeling good. Yeah, I think the first episode proved that this is really good for us to be creating content for people who haven't yet learned about the space.
Absolutely. And I really appreciated everybody who went out and left some kind of constructive criticism. I actually read through every single YouTube comment. In the future, for this episode, actually, we are also going to be listed on Apple Podcasts. So we are making a lot of progress.
Yeah, and also the questions about what you want to have covered. That's how we want to shape our future episodes. So do please keep telling us which things you want to hear about and which things were helpful to hear about.
Absolutely. And if we don't get to it right away, don't worry. There's a lot of information to cover. It's on our roadmap somewhere. And speaking of roadmaps, today we're going to be talking about what is a blockchain. We're going to start off by talking about what blockchain technology is striving to accomplish. Then we're going to talk a little bit about its history. And then we're going to go into how a blockchain works on the more technical side, but we're going to explain it without technical jargon, so it will be pretty easy to follow.
Exactly. The main thing is to try to provide analogies and make it easy for people to get to. And then finally, after that, we promised you guys we'd cover current events. So today we'll cover two current events, both China cracking down on Bitcoin miners and then El Salvador taking Bitcoin as legal tender now.
If there's a particular one of these topics that you're most interested in, we're also going to have timestamps in the description, so feel free to check that out. And before we start, as always, quick disclaimer, we both do own Ether, and this podcast should not be taken as financial advice.
So let's get started.
I thought it would be fun to start today's episode off by giving you a statement and seeing if you agree or disagree. Are you down to try that, Topher?
Okay.
Awesome. Blockchain technology is one of the greatest technological innovations of the 21st century so far.
I mean, I think it has the potential to be that, but if we get a little too ahead of ourselves here, then we'll just sound like the sort of hype that was happening in 2017.
I love that. You've been working in the space for the last 5 years, but you're still so humbled and nuanced with your approach.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to be because it has the potential to solve a lot of the internet's problems, but it certainly isn't there yet.
For sure. It's still very early in the development of blockchain technology. And this actually reminded me of a framework that helped me first understand the concept better. Technology is intended to solve problems. Blockchain technology is striving to solve a lot of the internet's fundamental problems.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, some of the founders of the internet and the first browsers argue that the internet had a quote original sin. And the original sin was that they didn't include a native settlement layer. In other words, a native way for you to send tiny, tiny increments of money as easily as you're able to send text messages or normal data.
Interesting. So, if the internet were to be rebuilt today and included blockchain technology, what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, if we had the ability to send micropayments, then we wouldn't have necessarily needed ads to monetize these giant websites, which would have then prevented us from being the product that big tech feeds on.
Yeah, and another example that everyday users would understand very well is working on the problem of legitimacy or verification. We all know somebody who has had their email or social media accounts hacked. They had somebody post things about them that was obviously not coming from their behalf.
Yeah, with the technology behind blockchain technology, it's not just about money, but it's really about having unforgeable signatures that prove that you are who you say you are, or that when you write something on this global shared piece of paper, that we know it was you who said this particular thing.
Right. So you're able to truly verify who put out the information. Another internet problem that blockchain is aiming to solve is security. There's a lot of websites that ask for your banking or credit card information, and it's often necessary to give that out in order to interact with a website. I just wish it was more secure.
Yeah, I mean, the whole use of credit cards and banking information is really antiquated. And it also, it really doesn't make sense if you think about it on a fundamental level, because when you give over your credit card information, that technically is a blank check to spend however much the merchant would like or the other party would like on your behalf. You think you're only authorizing a certain amount, but the way it actually works under the hood is that information can be used for any charge. Now, the way that we as a society ultimately are able to live with that trade-off is that there's this 90-day period where you can then claim any transaction was fraudulent and make the bank charge back that, undo that charge. But that then leads to this he said, she said accusatory pointing game where people are trying to prove that this was legitimate or not. And it's just really ridiculous when we already actually have the technology to only authorize specific amounts instead of this blank check model.
Well, hey, blockchain might not be the greatest innovation of the 21st century, but it still has incredible future applications. Still, it's very tricky to wrap your mind around it. Another thing that helped me better understand it, actually, on top of thinking about what problems it solves, was learning some of the historical context of how it was developed. First, you had the creation of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin blockchain. Then it paved the way for a more general blockchain, which we did touch upon in our first episode.
Yeah, and to really give credit where credit is due, Bitcoin was really building on the work of cryptographers for the past 40 years before that. So there was actually this thing called the cypherpunk mailing list, which were all of these academics who were doing all these different stabs at what a native currency for the internet could look like. And Bitcoin was ultimately the successful one, but there were a bunch of tries before that.
Interesting. So Bitcoin was the first successful native digital currency, and a lot of the ones before failed because they were all centralized, right? So decentralization came as a requirement from learning from the past failures.
Yeah, I mean, it was tying together mainly two different strands of academic thought. One of them was doing away with centralization, and the solution to that was this thing called proof of work. And then the other thing was giving us the ability for verifying that it was you who did this particular thing, and that comes from digital signatures. So this idea of proof of work and digital signatures, Satoshi was the one who tied those two together. They had been kind of two different spheres of thought in computer science.
Got it. So Satoshi combined proof of work and digital signatures, both mechanisms that we can get more deeper into in future episodes. But together they formed the backbone of the Bitcoin blockchain, which initially just powered a digital native currency, but then ended up being the building blocks for so much more.
Yeah, and I mean, before we get to more than that, I think it's worth noting that when Satoshi first proposed Bitcoin, it actually wasn't met with like a huge amount of praise and congratulations. Most people saw it as, oh, this is going to fail because of this or because of that reason. And I mean, one academic in particular, whose name was Hal Finney, had faith in it and was like, ooh, I think this might work, and messaged Satoshi and said, here are potential improvements. But it's really worth noting that there wasn't grand fanfare for multiple years, actually.
It's actually so crazy to imagine this mailing list and having this anonymous figure, Satoshi, working on a white paper. Again, something that was only possible because of the internet allowing this free communication that is then going to even build further onto it. It's just so mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting. I'm sure a lot of listeners probably know this, but if you don't, Satoshi Nakamoto is the name of the pseudonymous founder of Bitcoin, but no one knows who that is, whether it's a man or a woman or a group of people or some other group, maybe a government entity or something. No one knows who Satoshi is. And yeah, it's an interesting tidbit of history.
Right. And even though nobody knows who he is, his work is going to live on for so long. So he created Bitcoin and the Bitcoin blockchain, and he allowed people for the first time to be able to transfer this currency to each other. When was it that people realized that the technology could be used for other things as well?
Well, so people weren't even really taking it seriously as a currency until in 2011 when someone decided they asked on a forum, hey, if someone will order a pizza and send that pizza to my house, I'll send you 10,000 Bitcoins. And that was the very first use of it as a currency. And once that occurred, people realized that maybe this has legs as a currency. So people got kind of excited about it. But then people started asking, what if it could do more than just be a currency?
Well, that is a very expensive pizza. I hope whoever bought it really enjoyed it. And I guess the pizza really makes a lot of sense. And you could see part of it living on today with, Bitcoin influencers like Pomp selling Bitcoin pizza.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's become kind of a historical mainstay in crypto. Maybe if blockchain technology ends up really taking off, maybe it'll be more widely recognized as this really funny incident.
Right. But again, it was a very slow start. It took the community quite a bit of time to even think that something like Bitcoin could be viable. When did the idea of a blockchain that could transfer any type of value first arise?
Yeah, so the first attempt after currency to try to do more than that was people were trying to, on top of the Bitcoin blockchain itself, trying to convey property, but that was really hard to hack on top of it because, as I told you in the last episode, Bitcoin is more like a single use blockchain. All it does is transfer currency. And so for you to try to hack a way to have that currency represent more than just currency, you're really kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So the attempt was something called colored coins, which uh, briefly meant that people were trying to make bitcoins represent something else. But then people decided, you know what? Wait, why are we doing this with one hand tied behind our back? Why don't we just create a whole new blockchain that can do more than just currency? So people came out with an application specific blockchain that could convey domain names. Okay, so like www.whatever.com, that was sort of the property that was now able to be traded on this thing called Namecoin.
Got it. So, just to clarify, the property that people were trying to transfer could be anything they owned online.
Well, no. So in this specific one, Namecoin, the property was just ownership of www.blah.blah.blah.com. That's technically called a domain name. And right now in the current internet, when you buy a domain name, it's actually this like centralized institution that you buy it from and pay money to. And then whenever someone types that into their web browser, it redirects them to your website. And so people were saying, well, we shouldn't be relying on this central institution for these domain names. We should instead have a decentralized way of doing that. So that was their attempt at doing that by making an entire blockchain that just did this one thing.
Which then led into the general blockchain, which is what we talked about last episode. And it was basically the idea that it didn't make sense to have a separate blockchain for every single application, but there should be one that is programmable that you can have any kind of purpose.
Exactly. That was Vitalik's insight. Vitalik said, why are we making an entire new blockchain for each application? That would be like making an entire new internet for each app. Instead, why don't we make a generalized one that can represent anything anyone could possibly imagine? And then people can code those as applications on top of one shared blockchain. And that's what Ethereum is.
Well, on that note, I actually think this would be a really good time to switch into discussing how blockchain technology actually works.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. What would you like to hear?
All right, so the blockchain, based on your previous explanations, is this giant piece of paper that is maintained by a network of connected computers. Let's start off with how is it trustless by design?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Before I get to the trustless part, I probably want to describe it's not only like this giant shared piece of paper, but it's kind of more like a timeline of that piece of paper changing through time. So it's a way for us to kind of cement into place a particular sequence of events. So whenever you write something to it, it's like there's a conveyor belt of cement. And as you write something, it slowly hardens. And once it's far enough back, that is now definitively on there. And we can be sure that it is on there.
Got it. So, how do you use proof of work, which requires a lot of computational effort to maintain this giant piece of paper?
Yeah. So within that timeline, yeah, every time something new is added, it kind of is making anything else that's further back on the timeline that much harder to now undo. So if you wanted to undo something previously on the timeline, you have to go back through a certain number of things to undo that one further in the past.
Wait, but I thought it was immutable and that you can't undo it once it's on.
Yeah, so the very tip of the timeline, the very frontmost point, is kind of, it's like it's in a quantum state of being in a bunch of um, potential actions that are about to occur. And there are all of these people who are building the blockchain who are competing to be the next person to write onto this timeline. And so they all have different things that they potentially want to write on there. And so it's kind of like this battle of who gets to write the next little bit of information on this giant timeline.
And what determines who wins this battle and who gets their information on?
So in Bitcoin, what determines it is how much energy they've spent. So you run computers, and you do these mathematical puzzles that really don't accomplish anything beyond just proving that you used a lot of energy. And that then is a way for us to determine who is putting in more effort to getting to be the next person. The reason that we need to have any sort of limiting factor is if you didn't have any, then and it was just like how many requests there are, I could just write a program that sends a billion requests, and I would get to be the person for the next block. So we need to have some limiting factor, and for Bitcoin, that's energy consumption.
And how do you know that the information being put on this piece of paper is legitimate?
So everyone who wants to put any information on there has to sign it in this unforgeable manner. So the way that you're able to sign it in this really cool manner involves this fancy math, this cryptographic signature fancy math. And what it lets you do is, if you have this super long secret password, you're able to generate a super long secret password for yourself. Okay. It's called a private key. And once you've created this for yourself, then it would take the entire, all computers in the entire world, millions and millions of years to be able to forge a signature that you make using this long password, just because of how the math works out.
Is the reason why the math is so hard to solve also the reason why it takes so much computing power to validify a block?
No. So proof of work and digital signatures are actually two separate strands of thought. And so you don't actually need all of this computation in order to make it super hard to for those signatures to be forged. The cool thing about this math is that it is very easy for anyone to do in milliseconds. And so, yeah, those are two separate concepts. So you can still have the unforgeable signatures even without the energy consumption.
Noted. So let's say I want to add information to this shared piece of paper. What do I have to do, and what is the incentive for the people who are maintaining the blockchain, the miners, to make sure it goes through?
Yeah. So when you want to write something to this giant shared timeline of all of the events that have occurred in this universe of events, you have to pay a little bit of this native currency because you're taking up some of this shared space, and so it's sort of a commons. It's a public area, and so you're going to need to pay if you want to occupy some of that. And so then on the other side of the spectrum, these what are sometimes called miners or validators, or the people who are running the blockchain, the ones who are trying to write the next thing to the timeline, they're aggregating a bunch of these things people want to write, and then they're getting paid to then get to be the person who writes to the timeline next.
Interesting. So isn't that similar to how right now you have to pay a fee to transfer money, except that you're paying it to a decentralized group of computers?
Yeah, see, the difference is that because it's a decentralized group of computers, you're not going to get censored for what you want to write or what action you want to do. So the example you were giving might be something more like PayPal. Maybe PayPal takes a tiny fee or something when you do a payment, or maybe a social media platform is the one who transmits your message for you, and so then they take a micropayment of ads or something like that. But because we have an entire decentralized group of people who are all trying to write to the blockchain, it doesn't matter if one or a few of those want to censor you. Like the example I gave earlier about the oppressed citizen in the oppressed country, it didn't matter if their government didn't want them to announce this thing. There were other people from other countries who were willing to put this on the blockchain instead. And so that way you don't have to be throttled, or there's no choke point that we have to suffer under. It gives freedom back to the people.
It does give freedom, but what about cost? Because you are still paying a small amount of cryptocurrency to do this. Are the costs a lot less than what it would be otherwise?
Well, currently it's more because the technology is still advancing. So that's why when I said at the beginning, it's not yet enough to solve all of these cool problems that the internet faces, but it will be soon. The advances that have already been researched and are now being implemented, they will give a 10,000 scale speed up to the current capacity of the blockchain. And by doing that, you'll be able to lower the fees 10,000 times. And so this is a combination of these two different concepts we'll talk about later called sharding and rollups. When you combine those two, this 10,000x speedup is able to probably give enough capacity for our transactions to be sub 1 cent for anything that you want to do.
Yeah, for sure. And even though the technology isn't there yet, it does, of course, take time for the really important research and development to be properly implemented. And if anything, it just seems like it's a matter of time.
I mean, the example I like to give is dial-up internet. When the internet started, there was no way that you could stream a 4K movie over the internet. I mean, early on in the internet, even just loading a web page, it would load slowly from the top of the page to the bottom, like the background image of your web page or whatever. So you couldn't even transfer an image simultaneously. And now we're able to stream multiple Netflix streams simultaneously. Like the capacity of this technology is not the limiting factor because we have the understanding for how we can scale that. And so if anyone tries to downplay the capabilities of blockchain technology just because of the current state of scalability, they misunderstand how quickly those advances can occur.
Absolutely. And just to go quickly back to when we were talking about how the blockchain is working, another really fascinating part about it is, again, how there are so many different computers that are updating their internal pieces of paper to have the correct information. Can you explain a little bit about how decentralization works?
Yeah. So because any laptop, any different person's consumer computer can run the blockchain, you're then able to have you're not having to worry that a particular server is going to get wiped or disconnected by a government or a company is going to mess with it or whatever. So instead, we have copies of this timeline all over the world. And in fact, even if you don't want to compete to be one of the person who adds to the front of the timeline, you're still allowed to just download the entire state of the timeline of this giant shared piece of paper. That is it's open source. It's free for anyone to take. It's transparent. And so by you doing that, you can then verify for yourself that everything is functioning as it's supposed to. There was a saying back in Google's early days, their motto was "Don't be evil," and people argue that blockchain's motto or Ethereum's motto is "Can't be evil." This is all people cannot do otherwise because everyone can see it's transparent and open for everyone to be able to see the state of the world and how everything is functioning as it's supposed to.
Right. I mean, to create a different state of the world, you would have to have the majority of people changing their information, which just seems like that would be basically impossible.
Exactly.
This was a fascinating discussion about blockchain. As we mentioned, every 2 weeks we're going to be covering the fundamentals, but also we want to talk a little bit about current events. In the last week, the huge news was China cracking down on the cryptocurrency industry. They ordered cryptocurrency miners in Sichuan province to shut down their operations. Topher, maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened in China.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing to keep in mind with regards to this is that there have been many occasions when governments have seemingly made really big actions toward crypto and blockchain as a whole, and then they've pulled back, and it's maybe not as big of a deal as they said, or then they make another action, and then even if it is really big, they end up backpedaling themselves. For example, India has had a very negative stance toward crypto, and now recently they've pulled back, and even their Supreme Court has said that actually people are required to treat cryptocurrency custodians similar to normal money transmitting custodians.
Interesting. So, do you think there's a chance then that China might reverse their latest policies?
No, I mean, I think they probably are going to go ahead with this. So basically, what they did is they actually cut off the electricity to these miners. And the reason that they're able to do that is that Bitcoin mining uses so much energy. So if you weren't using a huge amount of energy, you would just be lost in the crowd of all of the houses and warehouses that are using electricity in an entire province. But these particular miners are using a huge amount of electricity because that is the limiting factor that Bitcoin uses for limiting how many people can add to the tip of the timeline. And so that's why they end up using such a disproportional amount of energy.
Well, speaking of energy, I think that was the Chinese government's official explanation for why they decided to do this. But what do you think the actual reason was?
Yeah, I don't think they were doing it for climate change purposes, even if that was their professed reason. That it's pretty clear that they want to maintain dominance of their currency. In fact, they're the main competitor to the U.S. dollar right now in the kind of the global currency wars. And not only is their normal currency the main competitor to the dollar, but they're actually ahead of the US with regards to developing a private blockchain version of their currency. So this is what's called a central bank digital currency, or a CBDC. And a bunch of different countries are like trialing this out, but China is one of the ones that are the furthest ahead with putting their currency on a private blockchain.
Interesting. So then in this case, they could see Bitcoin or Ether as direct competitors to trying to become the global dominant currency.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a lot of a government's power comes from them having control over the currency that everyone has to use. The US government often both inflates its currency or makes sure that certain goods are priced in their currency. So, for example, oil is required to be priced in US dollars, regardless of whether you're trading with the US or not. This is what's in macroeconomic circles, this is called the quote petrodollar. This is why one of the reasons why the dollar has such global dominance is this was an agreement that was made between the US and Saudi Arabia that if Saudi was going to sell oil, then they would have to denominate those sales in dollars, even if they weren't selling to the US.
Well, that's a really cool mini history lesson there. But I guess as somebody in the Ethereum community, does seeing this, even though it was action taken on Bitcoin miners, make you a little bit nervous that other governments might see and follow suit in trying to ban any kind of financial institutions from accepting cryptocurrencies or taking action against miners?
Well, yes and no, because Ethereum is moving away from miners. So it's still using proof of work for another few months, but proof of stake is already up and running in a testnet fashion, and the Ethereum blockchain itself is transitioning to that. So once Ethereum has transitioned to proof of stake, which should happen early 2022, then you won't be able to see Ethereum miners glowing up like on a heat map of energy usage, and so the government won't be able to pinpoint them because staking on a proof of stake network doesn't use a huge amount of energy. It uses the same amount of energy that a normal laptop uses.
Right. And I know that proof of work and proof of stake are concepts we're going to explore deeper in future episodes. But I guess the TLDR there is that switching to proof of stake is going to be a lot more energy efficient, but also be more strong against any kind of government interception.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
So now that China basically removed, 40 to 50% of the global Bitcoin mining population, what is this going to mean for the rest of the miners?
Yeah, I mean, you might think that that's super bad, and so that might be a negative for Bitcoin. But on the other hand, maybe that's a super positive view of Bitcoin's resilience, because by taking away such a large portion of the hash rate, the number of miners that are participating, that actually increases the rewards for the remaining 50% that are around the world. And so then suddenly there's this giant economic incentive for other people to jump in and start helping further the Bitcoin blockchain and validate the network. And so in a sense, it's like all of these little gophers that are popping up. The moment that someone tries to tamp down one, it just pops up somewhere else. So it's a very this is why a decentralized network like Bitcoin or Ethereum is so resilient.
That certainly sounds like the silver lining, but I also don't want to run out of time because another thing I wanted to talk to you about today was the news from, 2 weeks or so ago with El Salvador becoming the first country to adopt Bitcoin as a legal tender. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what your take is on that so far.
Yeah, I mean, here's some background that you should probably keep in mind. El Salvador has been using the dollar as the U.S. dollar as their legal tender for the last few years, and El Salvador is currently run by what the economists described as like a millennial authoritarian or pseudo authoritarian. So this isn't necessarily like a good regime to be tying things to. Some of the main high level takeaways of what the president and the legislature pushed was not only that all merchants are now need to uh, accept Bitcoin, but they're actually required to accept Bitcoin. And that's kind of a step too far with regards to the cryptocurrency community. A lot of the blockchain community is about free choice and is about optionality and is about openness and freedom. And this isn't as much about freedom. This is about forcing people to do a particular thing.
Interesting. So, is the Bitcoin community's opinion kind of split on this topic then?
Partially, I mean, part of the Bitcoin community is super excited that a country is going to this extent and is giving so much publicity to Bitcoin. But it's probably a little unfounded because the actual way that they're trying to make people accept Bitcoin payments is through a centralized app. They're not actually using the blockchain. And that centralized app converts everyone's Bitcoin to dollars immediately. So they're not even denominating the payments merchants are receiving in Bitcoin. So it's really more for show.
If it's more for show, then why would, the El Salvador dictator even be incentivized to do that?
Well, I mean, partially to get them to be less dependent on the US. Partially, it's been reported that the El Salvador president and his government actually they already owned some Bitcoin. So maybe partially to increase their investment, maybe for the publicity that it brought, all sorts of different reasons.
Do you think it might incentivize any neighboring or similar size or status countries to try to do the same?
I mean, it would be kind of worrisome or sad if they did, because, like I said, this isn't necessarily the best example of a country that you would want to be championing your cause. And the technology that they're using isn't actually taking advantage of any of the sort of freedoms or benefits that blockchain provides. So it's almost the worst of both worlds in that sense.
What would happen if, let's say, this experiment ends up failing? Let's say a lot of the merchants end up not following this policy, and maybe there's some kind of overturning. What would this mean for the Bitcoin community and then potentially the greater cryptocurrency community?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably a pretty big publicity point for if it falls flat, then it's going to fall flat rather publicly, and so that's probably not a positive for the industry as a whole, and just in general, it's a little disappointing because there are much better solutions that utilize Ethereum and utilize some of the scaling technology that already exists that do make some more practical uses available.
What would be an example of a solution that exists within the Ethereum ecosystem?
Well, it's possible for you to have a currency created on Ethereum, not Ether itself, but a currency created that's independent of any particular dollar, but is also volatility dampened. Okay, so there's this concept from engineering called PID controllers that basically prevent this potential currency from being too volatile. And one of the main things that you want in the currency that you use for transacting is for it to not be volatile. And if you were to do it on Ethereum, it would also be kind of agnostic, kind of decentralized, kind of credibly neutral. It would be, you wouldn't be kowtowing to a particular government's interests, but it could be a currency that all people are on equal footing to use.
Would an option have been to start some type of El Salvadorian currency on the Ethereum blockchain that is
Well, again,
independent and also more stable?
what I'm saying is that we don't necessarily need the currency to be tied to a particular government. It's actually only a recent phenomenon for the currencies we use to be deployed by governments. We've previously had private currencies, both with regards to private banks issuing them, and with regards to companies issuing them, and with regards to just people using actual commodities as the goods that they trade. We don't need to necessarily depend on countries for our currencies. And in fact, doing so gives these countries an incredible amount of leverage that lets them both abuse their own citizens and countries abroad.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to go a little bit against the fundamentals of which Bitcoin and later cryptocurrencies were created. But at the same time, even if there ends up being one leading cryptocurrency, that doesn't mean that all other currencies are going to be wiped off. So could it be that this is still an improvement on top of what currently exists?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a misnomer that people made the term cryptocurrency in the first place. I don't think that Ether or Bitcoin really should be thought of as a currency at all with regards to like buying a coffee or something like that. It's much more nuanced than that, and I think looking at it as just competing with the dollar or something is looking at it far too simplistically. So because the Ethereum blockchain is able to express absolutely anything you'd want to express, you'd probably actually want to build the global currency on top of the blockchain and not use the actual native settlement layer itself as like the unit everyone transacts in.
This is actually a great note to end on because in our next episode, we can give a little bit of a teaser. We are going to be talking about what a cryptocurrency is.
Yeah, I think too many people hear the phrase blockchain or cryptocurrency or whatever, but don't actually understand some of the nuances behind that. So it'll be good to do an entire episode just on the term cryptocurrency.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds so basic when you first hear it, but then you start going deeper and deeper and you realize that there's so much to know and even understand just to get the basic fundamentals.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's a misnomer to even say cryptocurrency. I don't think it's necessarily a currency. So we'll have a great discussion about that.
If you guys enjoyed this episode and you're listening on somewhere where you can give 5 stars or a thumbs up, that would be really helpful. We post new episodes once every 2 weeks on Sundays. And if people want to get in touch with us and leave feedback or comments, where can they do that, Topher?
So I'm on Twitter at Topher Benson. And where are you, Alexandra?
I'm also on Twitter with Alexandra V. Botez. And additionally, if you guys leave any comments on, let's say, YouTube or so, I will make sure to read them and get the feedback. I know we won't be able to cover every single question in the episode since it's already so information dense, but we will be looking at that and helping shape what we decide to cover every podcast.
Yeah, please do leave questions.
All right, well, until next Sunday, see you guys soon.